Hey, what's up? And welcome to another episode of Scientific Musings with Tope. Now, if you have seen one of my previous videos, you would know that I am a research scientist in disease physiology and more specifically in cardio-oncology. And yeah, what I pretty much do every now and then is I take you through, scientific phenomena, and I just try to bring it down to, a level that anyone would understand. Just break it down a little bit. And as much as cardio-oncology may not be the most interesting thing to hear about now, well, today I'm not going to be talking about it. I will be talking about something that's a lot more relevant, and that is the concept of the coronavirus disease 19 or COVID-19. Now, as we know, this pandemic has pretty much, taken the world by shock. It's led to the crippling of economies. Countries have been shut down. We're hearing all kinds of stories. There's conspiracy theories. There's just so much going on about this disease. And, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of true information. But one thing is that it's on everyone's lips, and everyone is kind of like wondering what is going on. Obviously, as time has gone, people have started to come up with their own theories, trying to understand it and asking why is this disease being taken so seriously? Why are we shutting down everything? And, some people have even gone to do their own digging and come up with facts of, oh yeah, geez, this other disease causes this amount of deaths, but why didn't we shut down with those, and why are we shutting down with this one? So yeah, pretty much in this video, I will be taking you through some of those theories, and not really theories, but just trying to understand why we're approaching it the way we are approaching it. And yeah, I'm not going to take you through the nitty-gritty of understanding the virus itself, because obviously there's a lot of virologists on YouTube who have done that, but just understanding the phenomena around it and why we need to take it seriously. First of all, the main thing that a lot of people have done is to compare COVID-19 with the seasonal flu or influenza. And yeah, they have quite a lot of similarities. We know that they're both airborne, they both attack the respiratory system, and both of them can be quite serious, While they have their similarities, they have a few subtle differences here and there. We know that the seasonal flu has a shorter incubation period than COVID-19. We also know that it has a lower reproductive number. Now, the reproductive number is pretty much how many people does a single infected person, spread it to. So a single infected person with COVID-19 will spread that infection to more people than a single infected person who has a seasonal flu. We also know that we understand influenza a lot more in the science world, in the medical world, even the general population. And we know that influenza tends to be more serious or affect people who are either children, pregnant women, the elderly, or have underlying conditions more. Similarly, COVID-19 also affects people who are elderly and have underlying conditions or morbidities more than the average person. Now, we also know that we have a vaccine for influenza, and so you can easily go get your flu shot, and you're pretty much good for that season, while we're still trying to find one for COVID-19. Now, those are the similarities. If you want to start breaking it down a little bit more, you can go into their mortality rates. Now, one thing we know is that globally, the flu is responsible for about 250,000 to 500,000 deaths a year. Now, that's quite a lot, but that's about 0.1% of the total amount of people who get infected with the seasonal flu per year. Another pretty serious infectious disease is TB, and it's another disease that people have brought up a lot in trying to understand why we're taking this approach to COVID-19. And the thing with TB is it is very infectious, it's also very deadly. It actually is responsible for up to 1.6 million deaths a year, which is quite a lot. Actually, TB has a mortality rate of 15%, meaning that 15% of people who are infected with TB, active TB, die from this disease. Now, that sounds really bad as well. But I guess we have to consider the fact that, TB has a high latency rate. So actually, a quarter of the world's population is estimated to have latent TB, which means most people have been infected with TB because of the fact that it's such a resilient infection, and it's one of those that can stay on surface for a long time, and you go around people who have TB without even knowing, and because of this reason, it tends to have a high latency rate because there's so many people who have it, and it just hasn't developed into active tuberculosis. Now, another thing with TB is even with those people who have active TB, the symptoms may last and may be mild for as long as 6 months, meaning that for about for close to 6 months, you may have mild symptoms here and there, so night sweats, coughs, and stuff like that, but you wouldn't necessarily know how sick you are, which tends to also cause a situation where people tend to get treated late for TB. But all of these also mean that there is a longer duration of time to prepare for and to treat TB. And I think it's important to note as well that people who have latent TB cannot infect other people. And I guess that's a characteristic that separates it from COVID-19. So now, when we move into COVID-19, I think it becomes more interesting because COVID-19, as we know, is still a pretty novel disease. People don't understand it. Scientists don't understand it as much as we would like to. And we have to go on current rates, so developments. And currently, we know that we've lost about 266,000 people to COVID-19 globally, out of about 3.8 million people who have had this disease, which accounts for a rate of about 6.9%, I believe. Now, that's definitely much lower than TB, but it's also higher than the seasonal flu. But I think what makes it interesting is the fact that these rates vary between places. It's not a fixed rate. So, depending on confounding factors, if I could put it like that, you have factors that influence the mortality rate of COVID-19, and you have varying rates in different countries. In countries like South Africa that have had a lockdown for quite a while now, their rate is as low as 1.9% mortality, while in countries like Italy it's gone as high as 13.8%. In the USA it's about 5.9%, and so you can see that the confounding factors include things like the infection rate and the ability, to treat, or the capacity to cater to people who have been infected by this disease. What makes COVID-19 so dangerous is the potential it has for overwhelming a health system. Now, the thing with this overwhelming of the system is, if we try to break it down into numbers, we know that the projections are that for different populations in different areas, say in different countries and stuff, about 80% of the population is projected to eventually get infected by COVID-19 if a vaccine isn't found, soon enough. And so, from that 80% of people, we know that about 15% of them will develop a severe infection. That means they will be sick. They won't have a mild or asymptomatic infection. They will actually feel quite sick. And then we have the more severe infections than the already severe infections, which are the critical infections. And those are the people who need intensive care, intensive therapy. And that's about 5% of this total people, or this total infection. Here's where it becomes interesting. And to just put it into perspective, what I will try to do is I'll use a hypothetical situation. So let's use a hypothetical country. I don't know what to name the country, whatever country. Let's say a country has about 50 million people, its total population. Now, we said about 80% of these people will eventually get COVID-19. Now, 80% of this 50 million is 40 million people. Now, what that means is 40 million people would eventually get or be infected by COVID-19 as time goes on. It's either over a long time or over a short span of time, but about 40 million of these 50 million people will get COVID-19. The estimations in a situation where there's no lockdown is that at 80%, or that 80% which is 40 million, you have 15 million people who develop a severe illness. So about 6 million of these people will be severely ill. They will be sick. You will also have 5% of these 40 million people, which is about 2 million people, we would develop critical illness, meaning that about 2 million people will need intensive care. And so I guess here's where it becomes interesting, because now you have to take into consideration things like what's the capacity of the health system. So I was reading a few articles here and there, and I saw an example with the UK, and I saw that they were hoping to have a total of about 18,000 ventilators. And so I decided, you know what, for this example, let's use a projection of about 20,000 ventilators. So we say our country has 50 million people. Our country will eventually have 40 million infected or COVID-19 infections. This same country will have, out of this 40 million people, 6 million people who have severe illness and 2 million people who are critically ill and need intensive care, i.e. 2 million people who would need ventilators. Now this country only has 20,000 ventilators. Now that sounds quite crazy, but you still have to break it down a little bit. To understand this a little bit more, I decided to use two extremes. I'm going to use the rate in the US, because I feel like they've had a very high testing rate, but they've also had a very exponential curve in, you know, the rate of their infections. And so I'm using that as a hypothetical situation of a country that has no lockdown. And so what I was able to calculate was that over the duration of time from the first infection till now, if you extrapolate the amount of tests they've done and the amount of confirmed cases they've had to their total population, they've had a hypothetical infection rate of about 500,000 people a day since the 22nd of January, when they had their first case, till now. Now, here's me assuming that they've tested the entire population and the rate has remained the same, meaning that the rate of infections right now has remained the same for this entire period, and we're extrapolating it till when the amount of tests is equal to the total population. So now we're saying 500,000 people a day, right? This means that if this country, our hypothetical country with 50 million people, was having an infection rate at this same rate that you have in a place like the US that has had no lockdown, it would take about 74 days to completely infect this 40 million people that we've projected to be infected. That's our 80%. And when you calculate it based on a 50 million people population, you would realize that it'll take only about 74 days, which is about 2.5 months to complete these infections. Meaning that in about 2.5 months, at the rate at which the infections have increased in the US, you would have infected 40 million people in a country with 50 million people. Now, I know that's quite interesting, but it's what the extrapolations come up to. So yeah, what does that mean? Now you have a situation where you have, in 2 months, you have 40 million people in a country of 50 million people who have been infected with COVID-19. Now, from those, from that amount, that 40 million people, only 15% of them will develop severe illness. That's about 6,000 people will get, 6 million people, sorry about that, will get severely ill. But now, from that 40 million, the health system will only be really overburdened with about 2 million of those people. And here's where it begins to look kind of tricky, because now you have a situation where you have 2 million people needing intensive care, and those 2 million people are going to need that intensive care within the duration of 2.5 months. Now let's be hypothetical, and let's say in an ideal world, let's say it only takes a single patient, a day under a ventilator to kind of recover slightly from, or to get better from COVID-19. In this situation, with 2 million people needing ventilators and using the full capacity of ventilators we've used of 20,000 ventilators, you end up in a situation where you need 100 days to get the 2 million people on a ventilator for a day each. which is already over the 2.5-month period. That already states that even in the most ideal situations, you will end up losing a number of people, not because of the fact that they weren't going to recover, but because of the fact that you weren't able to give them the care that they needed. That makes you realize, the potential of this disease. But now let's go down to a more realistic situation. And let's try and be hypothetical again. Let's look at, say, the rate that we've had in South Africa so far with the lockdowns that they've had, and say 1.95. Now, if we take that mortality rate and use that same 1.95 mortality rate in a country with 50 million people who've had the entire population of 80% of them infected with COVID-19, from that 2 million people, they will only have fatalities of about 39,000 people, which is quite low. But then what you now suddenly need to do is you have to take into consideration the fact that it doesn't take a day to recover. So each single person that goes on a ventilator would require a few days. Now let's say you have about 5 days, right? If each person needs 5 days for recovery, right? And you divide those 75 days, which is a 2.5-month duration during which the 2 million people are critically ill, by 5, you have 15. If you multiply that by the 20,000 ventilators, you would realize that if 100% of people who were on the ventilators recovered, we suddenly have a situation where about 300,000 people have recovered. Now, that's 300,000 people who have recovered out of 2 million people, meaning 1.7 million people would not have been able to be cared for with intensive care and would most probably pass because these guys are already critically ill and need intensive care. So now that puts you in a situation where you suddenly have a 4% mortality rate, because 1.7 million out of 40 million is about 4%, which sounds quite low. But the problem is this 4% mortality rate of 1.7 million people has happened within a duration of 2.5 months. Now you have that 1.7 million people with a 4% mortality rate in a single country of 50 million people, and that's higher suddenly than the 15% mortality rate of TB globally, which comes down to 1.6 million people. Now, that's an annual rate. 1.6 million people die of TB or died of TB in a single year. But now we suddenly having 1.7 million people possibly dying of COVID-19 within a 2.5-month period. Not because they couldn't have recovered, but because the health system was overwhelmed. And that's where it becomes more intriguing and why it becomes such a dangerous thing. And so that's why we need to take a number of things into consideration. And I think one of the biggest things we need to take into consideration is the fact that it is such a poorly understood disease. We do not understand the coronavirus that much. Most scientists do not. This is because, it's so novel. We have treatment regimens for the flu, we have the flu vaccine, there are treatment regimens for TB, even drug-resistant TB. You can fight it, you know what to do. Whereas with COVID-19, you treat the symptoms and hope. Pretty much. That's the current system. There's no established treatment regimen. So we have to understand that because of this reason and because of the fact that we don't know if it's going to mutate. Another thing that we're seeming to see is that there seem to be secondary infections, meaning that unlike the flu virus where you get it once and you're pretty much good for that season, you may get COVID-19, recover and get it again. And if we take our scenario into consideration, we've had 40 million people who've had COVID-19. We've had, say, 80% of them who have recovered. But now from that 80%, we do not know if COVID-19 causes damage to other, long-term damage to other organs in the body. Meaning that you may recover from COVID-19. This is hypothetical, and it's things that we're not sure about and why we can't take the chances. Because you may recover from it, and then suddenly you have an underlying condition due to your initial bout of COVID-19. But now, if you get a secondary infection, you may suddenly fall under high risk, whereas initially you weren't high risk. And so that's why you have to think about stuff like flattening the curve, which I will get to just now. Another consideration to take is the fact that we have to consider our healthcare professionals. These guys are putting themselves on the line every day, and they're at physical risk, they're at risk for mental strain as well. And when you overwhelm the system, you're unable to provide them with enough personal protective equipment to equip them for this condition. So suddenly you have health professionals also dying, you have the risk of them taking it home and spreading it to their families, and you can imagine the mental toil on them. And so it becomes important to flatten the curve. Now what flattening the curve does is it extends the period in time. So rather than having a situation where you have such a high rate and high amount of people and you have so many people getting it within that short span, you extend that period. Now what extending that period does is it gives the health system the ability to absorb it, meaning that fewer people die because of the lack of access to health care, and rather it's a situation where they just couldn't fight it anymore. And during that period, what happens? You give your scientists, you give your healthcare professionals, you give them the opportunity to understand the disease more and to come up with a solution. So yeah, I hope you've taken a thing or two from this video. It's not time to panic, but it's neither time to be careless. I think it is important for each one of us to play our roles when it comes to this. And let me know what you think. If you have other theories, if you have confounding factors, if you don't understand something, put it in the comment section and we can discuss. But yeah, my take-home message from this is that we can get over this if we take the right precautions. Stay at home. When you have to be out, stay socially distant. Practice your hygiene. Sanitize, wash your hands as soon as possible. Avoid touching your mucous membranes, your mouth, your nose, your eyes. And yeah, stay safe. Let's be strong through this together. Thank you for watching this video. Hope I'll catch you at the next one.